From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
California Governor Gavin Newsom signs a law to create a commission regulating the fast food industry. But are the likely effects what he and other Democrats have in mind? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Alicia Finley and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. Welcome to you both. The legislation is called Assembly Bill number 257, also known as the Fast Food Accountability and Standards Recovery Act, or the FAST Recovery Act. And here's Governor Gavin Newsom announcing on Twitter on Labor Day that he had signed it into law.
We recognize there are sectors of our economy where we're falling a bit short. And one of those areas is fast food workers. And I want to thank Assemblymember Holden in particular for AB 257 and all of his hard work, a bill that empowers our workers, particularly in that sector, giving them more voice, giving them more choice, creating a new council. And I'm proud on Labor Day to sign that bill and to shrine it in law.
Alicia, you heard the governor there, more voice and more choice. Can you give us a sense of what this bill actually would do?
So the bill has been changed a little bit since we wrote about it in June. Initially, it actually included a joint employer provision that would have held corporations liable for any kind of labor infractions of their franchisees. This bill would apply to any fast food joints that are part of national chains with more than 100 locations across the country. So not just 100 locations in California, it'd be about over 100 locations nationally, and would set this fast food labor council appointed by the governor and legislative leaders. It'd be a 10-member council that would set the wages and working conditions, benefits as well for fast food employees across the states, at least to the extent that they are covered by this law. It's expected to apply to a little over 16,000 franchise locations run by about 5,800 franchisees. You know, you can think of Cinnabon, El Pollo Loco, Taco Bell, McDonald's, almost all of these big chains would be covered. But you have to remember, most of these locations, I mean, they're franchisees. They are not part of these corporate conglomerates. The corporations do not run them. They license the brand, essentially, to these individual owners, individual managers who usually they set their working conditions, they set the wages. Now the state is swooping in and is going to essentially, ironically, limit competition across the space by setting the wages as well as working conditions and benefits. Now the wages provision was included or amended that they couldn't increase the wages by more than $22 next year. That's about $7, or it'll be $6.50 more than the minimum wage is next year, and supposedly wages cannot increase by more than the inflation rate, or at max 3.5% in a given year. And this was actually inserted into the bill during the final hours, intended to mollify some moderate Democrats who were getting a little weak-kneed, so to speak, about voting for this bill that would crush many of their constituents.
And this definition of the law applying to franchises with 100 stores nationally is one point of contention, and I would point to a blog post by the president of McDonald's USA. And he underlines some of the points that Alicia made. If you are a small business owner running 2 restaurants that are part of a national chain like McDonald's, you can be targeted by the bill. But if you own 20 restaurants that are not part of a large chain, the bill does not apply to you. For unexplainable reasons, brands with fewer than 100 locations are excluded. He goes on to say, even more mystifying, the legislation excludes certain restaurants that bake bread. I can only conclude that this is an outcome of backroom politicking. This is a clear example of picking winners and losers. And Mene, this 100 line, this bright line of 100 locations, seems like it sets up some odd incentives. If you are a person who owns, 1 or 2 restaurants that are currently chain affiliated, you have a real incentive to drop out of those chains and to rebrand them as, Kyle's, Mene's restaurants, what have you. Or on the other side of things, if you are part of a chain, if you have a restaurant or 2 that's part of a chain that currently has, let's say, 95 restaurants nationally, you're not covered by the bill right now. But if somebody opens 5 restaurants across the country in New York or South Carolina or something totally unrelated to what you're doing, and you may even be unaware of it until one day you wake up and are informed that your brand now has 100 restaurants nationally, so you are now under compliance of whatever this commission says.
Yeah, you're right to kind of hone in on the disparate treatment of franchise restaurants versus non-franchise restaurants and the ways that it doesn't really make economic sense to treat them differently. There are a whole lot of relatively small and medium-sized proprietors in this country who open up a few franchise restaurants, could be one or two. Sometimes it's, about 10 or so, but they're still fairly small in the scope of their operations, and they have pretty direct oversight over setting wages at their restaurants, over how those restaurants are going to operate. They do obviously have to comply with some standards that are set by the franchisor from whom they're essentially renting the brand, but they basically act as small employers and kind of play that same role in their local communities that we envision when we think of small businesses. But this California bill basically is going to subject them to this scrutiny and the ability to have the minimum wages of their employees set just because they happen to be affiliated with a larger national brand. And I think it really kind of shows that as much as the California Democrats who created this council are saying it's all about helping the bottom line of struggling workers, the fact that they're creating this disparate standard shows that it's partially just about politics. There is a pretty broad bias, particularly in a lot of blue states, against these national brands. There's kind of a preconceived notion that they tend to exploit their workers. And so they know that it's going to be much more politically popular to create a policy that goes after these big recognizable national chains, your McDonald's, your Burger Kings, etc. But they also know that there would be a big backlash if the smaller independent restaurants around the state were hit by the same regulation, even though they're paying similar wages or the same types of work. They're exempting those smaller restaurants, not because it makes any difference on policy grounds, just because they know it would be really politically harmful to go after them. So it kind of exposes the cynicism of the policy.
There are also some exemptions in here for union shops. Alicia, can you take us through those provisions and what they suggest about what the real aim of this bill is?
Actually, the biggest supporter of the bill and who was pushing it was the SEIU. And that is mainly because the bill includes an exemption, a carve-out for employers that have collective bargaining agreements that pay at least 30% more than the state minimum wage. So you can imagine that's around $20. So this is essentially trying to set a wage floor, $20. Of course, the council, as we mentioned, can go up to 22, but it's essentially trying to force these employers to agree to union shops, either sign, neutrality agreements with the unions to allow them to unionize their workers, because this could be less onerous and less draconian than what the state might mandate in terms of both wages, benefits, and other quote-unquote working conditions, which could include anything from hours and flexibility in terms of arranging the schedules. The other way that this could help the unions is the quote-unquote working conditions, which aren't really defined in the bill. So they could be that employers could be required to let unions come in and talk to their workers and help organize them. It could be that McDonald's or a franchise could be required to even pay a worker to take time off to help organize other joints in the state. Again, it's very vague. Which gives the council a lot of discretion over how to interpret the bill and leeway to impose these kind of labor-friendly standards or labor-friendly rules across the industry. The SEIU has struggled for years to unionize fast food restaurants. You've heard about the Fight for 15 campaign, which has been trying to, galvanize support across the country for unionizations. But it's very difficult in the fast food industry, in particular, restaurants in general, to be honest, because these are generally small employers. They may have maybe a dozen workers. And going from location to location, it requires a lot of effort and spending a lot of money to organize the restaurants. And there's a pretty high turnover, too. So workers often don't stay for more than a few months. So it would require a lot of investment to run a union campaign. This is essentially trying to facilitate that.
A few more of the nuances that jumped out at me as I was looking at the text of this law. First, the way that they define a fast food restaurant is a chain store providing food and beverages to customers who order, pay before eating on premises with limited or no table service and with items prepared in advance, including items that may be prepared in bulk and kept hot. And so you can imagine some of these people running these restaurants are probably looking at that list and thinking, would it be cheaper to begin to offer some table service than it would be to comply with whatever the mandates are that are coming down? There's another carve out when a restaurant is located and operates within a grocery establishment and the grocery establishment employer employs the individuals working in the restaurant shall not be considered a fast food restaurant. So that suggests that there will be an incentive for the creation of shops that you already see this sometimes. Dunkin' Donuts is, McDonald's is inside of a Walmart, creation of more shops like that inside a grocery establishment, and for the grocery establishment to be the entity that operates and runs the restaurant. Then I mentioned earlier this carve out for places that bake bread, which is a little bit interesting. An establishment that on September 1, 2022 operates a bakery that produces for sale on the establishment's premises bread as defined, blah, 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 shall not be considered a fast food restaurant. I can't figure out what that is directly aimed at. Maybe it's Panera Bread operations. It says the establishment must produce for sale bread as a standalone menu item. So if you bake bread as part of creating sandwiches, that's not covered. But if you allow people to buy the bread, that is covered. And Monet, I can only conclude what the president of McDonald's USA did, which is that this is a great example of government picking winners and losers.
Right. I mean, I certainly can't give any solid explanation of why there would be a carve-out, for example, for institutions that bake bread, but I'll take a stab at it. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier in the sense that there is this sense that fast food restaurants are not the kind of establishments that we want to have in our cities and towns. I think this is a pretty widespread view among the kind of progressive elite policy set that dominates Sacramento. But they want to simultaneously start regulating these restaurants and mandating wage increases, but they want to make sure it doesn't hurt the sort of establishments that they like and that they think are popular. And so they probably offered this carve-out to protect smaller bakeries or the sorts of establishments that you might find in the towns where they live and that they like to frequent. And so it, again, just goes back to the bias that exists in this policy. But more generally, it just sort of takes me back to that clip that we played of Governor Newsom upon the signing, talking about how California's economy has been performing well, that we've seen wage growth, but the fast food industry just isn't up to snuff. And so you have him basically saying explicitly, we are discriminating against a particular industry. We believe that we know better than the restaurant operators themselves do how high wages should be, what level of employment there should be, what the best business practices are, and we're going to create a council that's going to mandate these wages and practices. And so it really just shows this kind of micromanaging approach to the state economy that probably is going to prove ineffective and also is going to have unintended consequences. They seem to be approaching the issue from the perspective that they can mandate these wage increases and that the restaurants will continue operating the same way that they did before, only offering higher wages. But as we pointed out, the real consequence is either going to be price increases or store closures if they find that customers aren't able to tolerate those price increases, or in some cases, you're going to see restaurants starting to change their business practices to accord with some of these exemptions that were built into the bill so they can continue essentially doing business as usual, just with a slight change that gets around the corners of what this new council is mandating. So I think that a couple years from now, after this bill is implemented, we're probably going to see a lot of unexpected activity from these restaurants that was not at all predicted by the people who put the bill together.